Welcome. This video interview is one of a series of 7. My name is Chris Heald. Throughout these videos, I will be interviewing John Beckford. During the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2020, John and I wondered why cybernetics and its learning about systems has not played a greater role in the global response to the pandemic. We concluded that cybernetics was not as accessible as it should be. So we decided to conduct these interviews. John is currently president of the Cybernetics Society and has written extensively on the subject. We are both consultant practitioners who use the ideas in our work. We have known one another and collaborated for approximately 20 years. We have never made videos before. Each one lasts about an hour. The series is in a logical order, but they are also designed to be standalone, so you don't need to watch them in sequence if you choose not to. We have had great fun making these videos, and as Stafford Beer might suggest, we hope you will find them more or less useful. Please feel free to contact either of us. So today we're going to look at how we might use and apply some of the things we've been talking about in earlier episodes. So John's going to take us through the kind of diagnosis, how we might use cybernetics for diagnosis, prognosis, and then the kind of therapeutic response. So, you know, what we might do and where we might intervene in a system. And it's inevitable there that we're going to go back and link into some of the principles we talked about in earlier episodes and some of the kind of models and ideas such as the trialogue and the potentiometer that we looked at. But I know that John wants to start by thinking about, you know, what we mean by a model. So John, I think you want to talk about that as your entry point to this session.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. We've been talking about a model now for several episodes of this discussion without really defining what we mean by a model. So in simple terms, what we call a model is a description in some form of the system or organization that we're observing, and we look at that and we abstract from the full richness and reality of this thing some key characteristics that we think are important in relation to the way it's performing, that we believe that we can do something useful about in the sense of subsequent intervention. So there's a richness going on in any organization, in any operating system that we can't fully capture. But what we talked about a couple of times ago was the notion that Conan-Dashby theorem, every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. And what that tells us is that we have to create an abstraction which allows us to understand how that system manages itself. And in being able to do that, we're able to define a difference, if you like, between the thing that we want, the thing that we're getting, and the gaps between them, so that we can understand that we have a basis for action in closing the gap between what we see and what we would like to see in terms of the operation of the system being observed. Does that make some sense to you, Chris?
Yeah, no. So effectively, I understand now why you want to talk about a model. So a model is a kind of representation that makes it manageable for us to look at, because we're not trying to describe absolutely everything about the whole system. We're trying to capture it in such a way that enables us to then work with it and to understand the key features of it. Is that what you're getting at?
That's absolutely right. And because we've got to pretend to be academic from time to time, in 1976 a chap called George Box wrote, and I quote, "All models are wrong, some are useful," unquote, which Stafford Beer some 9 years later modified slightly. But that's a really good starting place. All models are wrong, some are useful.
So
And
when he says they're wrong, he means they're incomplete because they don't describe the whole. That's what he's basically saying there. Is that right?
they're incomplete. They're informed by, to some extent, what the observer is able to see, to
Yeah.
some extent, particularly in a societal context, what the observer chooses to see. So we make selections in the characteristics and the attributes of a model that we create, and being aware of the fact that we're making selections is really important, because that tells us something about the assumptions that underpin the modeling itself.
So our awareness of the assumptions and the restrictions that we're building into it, and being open to those. Yeah, that makes loads of sense. Okay.
Absolutely. And Stafford Beer translated that original quote as, I don't remember what he said now. It's gone straight through my head again. A model is neither true nor false. It is more or less useful. And so one of the things that I commonly do in practice is I might build multiple models, multiple abstractions from, and one of them might speak more to people, one of them might speak more to information, because what they're doing is they're enabling us to have a meaningful conversation. So rather than asserting the rightness of the model, what we're saying is, look, is this a useful way of thinking about it? What does it illuminate for us? And what does it occlude? What does it make more difficult rather than less difficult if we come at it from this angle? So we have an interesting discourse then that we engage the client, which might be the owner of a system, or the staff members of a system, might be an entire population if we're playing with it at a national level, in a conversation about not just the problem, but also the way in which we choose to model the problem.
So are we now in the diagnosis phase then? Is that what we're talking about here? That effectively we use this model to hold up a mirror to our clients, that gives them some insight about the system that they are in or responsible for.
Yes, and diagnosis is a really important word, because what we're doing is we're distinguishing. It's multi-layered, but we're distinguishing between the situation as we observe it and describe it, the model, and the situation as its owners, the people who populate that model, who give it life, would like it to be. So we have to have an interesting conversation about purpose. And we've talked about purpose and identity. Why are we doing what we're doing? What does this organization exist to do? And our modeling is telling us whether or not we believe, from our observations, it's configured in a way that enables it to do that. So we're comparing what they said they wanted to do with what they're actually able to do, given the way that the organization is put together. And in doing so, we're usually able to tell, we're always able to tell what the gaps are. And those gaps then become the basis for action. And they don't fall into neat labels of finance or commerce or or audit or whatever. They tend to be messy. They tend to have shades of human behavior, of process, and particularly of information flow, which generate, if you like, some of the gaps. And some of them can be blatantly obvious. There is no mechanism for controlling X is sort of quite a common finding, or the institutional response to X is always this, and therefore it generates a problem. So the risk, of course, with this is that the diagnosis belongs to the expert rather than belonging to the people who own and manage and operate a system. And hence the conversation is really critically important. How are we, as supposed experts, engaging with the people in the organization who are probably its true experts in those senses, in order to have a conversation about how it might get changed?
Okay, so the expert there is playing a kind of enabling facilitator role, really, to help the people in the system, see the diagnosis, understand how it's working, and the gaps and differences between how it is working, observed, and how they wish it to work, what it should do to fulfill its purpose. Is that broadly what you're saying?
Yes, that's more or less right, and it's one of the challenges for an expert is to be a non-expert, in the sense of allowing and encouraging and enabling the people in the organization to make their own decisions about what they want to do, but kind of acting as a guardian of the ideal. So as an expert, I'm able to say, you know, given A and B, I think this, and I think it because, and the because is the grounding in the understanding of how, from a cybernetic perspective, organizations or systems function, and therefore what is dysfunctional about what I'm observing. But if the people in the system don't agree with me, it may or may not affect my sense of rightness, but it does affect their ability or decision to do something about it. So the engagement in jointly owning the diagnosis is critical. Otherwise, it's just another expert exercising power over some less expert people in a particular context. And particularly in organizations which are societal in nature, if a decision is being imposed on it by an external actor, then A, the system will resist, it will not want to adopt the changes. B, when you take the pressure off, it'll just bounce back. So actually it'll revert to its current status unless the people in it persist in making it different. So there's a really sort of rich engagement process around ownership, if you like, of the diagnosis, which to a large extent can't be rushed as well. So there's a time element to that, there's an understanding element to it, so that the people inside the system genuinely own the changes that need to arise.
I guess in that process, you are part of the system, and you're building kind of empathy and trust with the people that are making choices within it. So that's the engagement you're talking about there, isn't it?
Very much so, and that's difficult because you're and we've talked about occupying multiple roles before. You're occupying two roles in that system. You're part of the system, but you're also observing the system that you're part of,
Yeah.
and consequently, inevitably, to some extent, compromised. So that takes us nicely to the next point, which is the prognosis point. Is that where you were going?
There's a couple of things I'd like to understand more about diagnosis here.
Okay.
So, because what does it look like? What does a model look like? I mean, is it a spreadsheet, picture on a flip chart? I mean, when you're doing this, what does it look like? That's that.
Quite commonly, it looks like a list.
Okay.
Again, how we use words, how we use pictures, how we use worksheets, how we use spreadsheets, these are all mechanisms that illuminate the conversation. So we might, for example, produce an organizational diagram that looks and feels and shapes up a bit like the viable system model, in the sense of having structural elements particularly around the trialogue and the activities that fit within each one. We might have process diagrams that describe how the organization moves from an engagement with a customer to a satisfied customer, and what the decisions and control processes are in that. It might be an information systems diagram that locates data around the organization. And it might be, and quite often, particularly at very senior level, a conversation in a coffee shop, or where the model is being built in the heads of the participants as much as it is represented on something external to itself. Now, we can move and have moved in other circumstances to very formal models. So some of the models that sit on my laptop are big spreadsheet models of organizational processes. For example, there's one for sterile supply, which has 2 million moving parts in this spreadsheet. It's horrible and horrendous. But what it enables us to do is to display back to the organization the way in which its processes work and don't work, so that their mental model, their abstraction of how their sterile supply process works, can be re-informed by something that's an instantiation of their process inside a machine that enables us to represent particular points. So that one's a spreadsheet. Others might be done in databases, but what they're doing is they're doing the same thing. They're taking the full richness of the organization, condensing some element or elements of its interactions in a way that let us show to to the people in the system what happens when they make certain decisions, and particularly where you have complex and compounding decisions because they're operating over time or because they're cyclical in nature. That's a really powerful way of helping people to understand their decision making, and when they understand their decision making, they can make choices about doing things differently. So you have this whole range of abstractions, some of which are purely representational, and commonly working with a client, you build these models in real time on a whiteboard or on a flip chart, and what you're doing is you're creating a representation of the conversation that you're having, and using that to inform the discussion. More formally, you can come to, so Stafford Beer's viable system model has a particular structure, has a particular way of representing the world, has a particular set of conventions about how things are articulated. And the more formal you become in doing that, the easier it is to replicate, obviously. So you're able to more easily build the same model again. But in doing so, you have to be conscious of the extent to which you're constraining the conversation into a particular set of conventions. And that set of conventions conditions what it is possible to say and hear. So you have to be a thoughtful, creative person saying, how can I help these people? How can I help illustrate the point I'm trying to make with some representation thereof?
So I mean, that's a great answer, because there's a raft of different things that you use to actually, you know, create this model and build these pictures that make meaning in the for the client, for the people that are in that system. And I mean, a couple of things struck. I'm wondering, do you ever create a physical representation of a model? Would you do that?
The most fun one I ever had was in a coffee shop in Singapore, where I built the entire viable system model using the little pots of milk and the sugar bags and sugar tubes, and I literally created a physical instantiation of the model as a means of describing this particular organization on a breakfast table with 3 or 4 people sat around me. I've done it with lolly sticks and cutlery. Because what you're doing is you're kind of saying, like, here is a thing, and we'll call this. I've got one here. I've got a drinks mat, so we can call the drinks mat a trialogue. So we have 3 of those, and we assemble a thing that looks like the trialogue, and we use it to talk about the relationships between things and the contents of those things. I mean, ultimately, it's useless. It's just a drinks mat, but the conversation lets you externalize it. It lets you put it, it's no longer a debate between you and I. It's a conversation between us about a thing which is external to us, which is a representation of our conversation that allows us to have a better conversation, because it stops it getting, we don't get into I'm right, you're wrong. We get into tell me about this thing, tell me about your understanding of it. Oh, well, I don't see, and it's common, I don't see it that way, I see it this way. That's fine. Move the model around. What's the impact of having that change? And in doing that, the understanding changes, because actually what we're really about here is changing understanding. And all these models are just devices for doing that.
Yeah, no. And do you find that you always end up teaching your client about cybernetics and trialogues and potentiometers and stuff, or does that just emerge at some point, or do you actually, is there an education piece in this diagnosis phase?
I seek as far as possible to create a set of conditions under which they educate themselves.
Okay. That's a very formal answer.
Well, so I can't teach you unless you want to be taught. So my task is to make what I'm saying sufficiently exciting or intriguing or stimulating that you ask questions about it. Because again, there's a huge power issue at play. Somebody like me turns up with a head full of books, some I've written, some I've read, 30 years of experience of doing this stuff, and I'm walking into a situation where the client, until I walked in, sort of vaguely aware of who I was, but knows nothing of the subject matter. So if I walk in and just tell them how to do it. All the power remains with me, all the understanding remains with me. The thing will ultimately fail, and actually whatever is done won't be a matter of their choice, it'll be a matter of mine. If the answers we're going to generate, if the changes we're going to generate as a result of a cybernetic intervention are going to be sustainable, then they have to belong to the people in the organization. So that means they have to have the opportunity to understand and be able to articulate their view of the world. And I then filter that through mine, feed it back to them. And yes, I seek to persuade and educate and cajole and encourage and entertain to quite a large degree, to get them to buy my ideas, if you like. But they have to ultimately make the choice to own the idea, to own the outcome, and to implement the changes that result. And if they choose not to, then I can stand and say, well, if you don't, this is what's likely to happen. But it has to be always their choice. So yes, it is hugely educational, but that education is partly about propagating the knowledge, but it's mainly about people being able to make their own informed choices.
And I think you've probably answered my other question, and you're certainly moving us on to prognosis now. But because my other question was the extent to which, because you said the diagnosis can take a long time, building a model can take a long time. And I was wondering, how tolerant clients are about that, because quite a lot of them need and want quick fixes. But you're describing how they get engaged and excited and interested. So I guess they tolerate it while they're engaged in it.
Again, it's there's a 5-minute version. And I would say this, wouldn't I? I can walk into most organizations. When we used to walk into organizations, you could walk in, you can tell a lot about an organization from the process of making an appointment to see the chief executive, from the process of sitting in reception waiting to be seen, from a 5-minute walk around a factory environment. You can start drawing on your knowledge and experience of how the world works, how organizations work, to start making some internal log, if you like, of things that might need work. But more importantly, your conversation with the people presenting, whether it's a chief executive or a board or whatever, if you go into that conversation asking questions, then very rapidly people start to give you their diagnosis. And in giving you their diagnosis, you say to a chief executive, so, why am I here today? Why have you invited me into your office? Because typically chief executives don't invite you in because there's nothing wrong. They invite you in. It's a bit like going to the dentist or the doctor. People turn up at the doctor because they've got a pain or they've got bleeding from an inappropriate place. So the first question is, how can I help you today? And the chief executive, having invited you in, will say, I'm feeling a bit of pain in my left elbow, which immediately enables you to start conducting some sort of diagnostic conversation informed by their discomfort rather than more than so your part of it is informed by your understanding of organizations in general. Their part of it is informed by the pain or discomfort they're experiencing. And I'll quite often say to a chief, what is it that keeps you awake at night? What worries you most? And when they start to talk to you about that, you're into the, why does it worry you? What's the problem that might arise? What do you think causes it? At which point they will happily tell you generally all the things that they think are wrong with the organization. So in a sense, what you're then doing is mapping that description into the idealized model in your head of what you think a viable organization looks like, and being able to say, so does that mean X? And they kind of go, oh yeah, that's a marvelous insight. How did you get that? And the honest answer is, well, you just told me, rather more than it is anything else. And once you've started to demonstrate the ability to show an insight that they haven't previously had, even if actually all you're doing is mirroring back something that they've said, then how did you get to that insight starts to become the next question. Well, I use this mental model over here. Let me tell you about the trialogue. And I know you've done this. Have you thought about it in these terms? Yeah, there are 3 functions of management. There's over here, there's nurturing identity. Up here, there's managing what we do today. And over there, there's sort of creating tomorrow. And what happens in between those three things is a conversation. And we call this thing the trial log. So what you've just described to me is over here, you've got a route in the public sector and you came out of that and you've had some challenging times over a period of time. And over here, your customer demands are changing around the future and you think about how you deal with that. And down here, meanwhile, you're delivering all these contracts you've currently got. Sitting between those three things is a thing that we'll call, for the purpose of this conversation, tension. And the reason we're having this conversation is we want to resolve the tension between these three dimensions of the organization. And they go, oh yeah, that's right. And away you go.
Yeah. Okay, so diagnosis, I mean, we're going to move on from it, but in the diagnosis phase, there's, there is some education and involvement going on, but there's a massive amount of making sure that actually the diagnosis is owned by the people in the system rather than by you as the expert. And there's a kind of extraordinary range of different things you might do, from enormous spreadsheets on your computer, from playing around with cutlery and salt and pepper pots, to help actually make sure that people have gain insight and create this kind of model of what's going on in their system, in their worlds. So prognosis, then, that's where you are wanting to take us, the what will happen if we do nothing kind of thing, I imagine.
Very, very, very much so. So I can't remember, I think it was Russ Aikoff who talked about understanding the future we are currently in. So when we observe the organization, when we've done our diagnosis, we are recognizing that the organizational situation is at some level always dynamic. And that dynamism, some things will change, some things will stay the same. But it's usually possible, it's always possible, to make an assertion on the basis of your diagnosis about the future of the organization, which is rooted in understanding of where it is and the things that are either changing or not changing internally and externally. So and a simple one would be, if you're a manufacturer of motor cars using internal combustion engines, then your future is inherently uncertain, because in 8 years, 9 years time, you won't be able to sell them anymore. So the future you are currently in is you're going out of business in 9 years time, unless you do something different about the motors that you use to move your vehicles around with. It's nice and simple, and it's very long term, and it gives the organization an insight that lets them say, oh, we need to do something about that. What might it be? And generate a series of answers. As you come down from the sort of the whole organization down to smaller parts thereof, what you might see in a manufacturing line is there's a process which is running, and that process uses various inputs to generate widgets of some sort, which are turned into outputs of the process. And the diagnosis is saying, you're making, number of parts that you're making are failing. What you can be reasonably confident about is, if your observation says that that process is stable, and here we might use sort of tools from quality control, like statistical process control, for example. If the system is stable, then what you can say about it is, unless you change one of its operating parameters, it's going to continue making failed parts. So what's the intervention we might need to make in that in order to reduce the number of failing parts? So your very simple prognosis is, unless you change one of the inputs, then you're going to continue to make parts that don't work or don't fit. Then you can dive down and say, which of these various inputs is it that we might change? Which might be something physical, might be something hard about a setting on a machine or a flow rate or whatever, or it might be something about the skills and behaviors of the operators of the system. So you're saying, the machine over here does this much, but actually the human operator who, what's a good example? Burger King, McDonald's, the operator who assembles the burger, the bun and the burger and the lettuce and the sauces and all the rest of it, has as much an influence on the quality of what comes out as does the machine that toasts the bun and burns the burgers. So we need to understand in that process, do we need to, what's the thing that we need to change? And the third element of both is, and what's the information flow? And again, this links us particularly into management. If I feel as an operator on a production line that I have freedom to make a choice about precisely how I do something, I'm more likely to be able to change it than if I'm constrained to work in a particular way. But the point is, whether it's at the whole organizational level and a 10-year view, or the short-term immediate process level, we can, on the basis of our modeling, make a meaningful assertion about what's likely to happen. We can then compile that, if you like, or aggregate our findings into a model that says, in 6 months' time, if you carry on doing what you're doing, this is roughly where you're going to be. Now, we might express that in terms of, and it's a way I commonly do it because it's a thing that organizations like, is to express the result of their continued actions in that way as a financial model of the future. And a financial model is quite a useful way of doing it, because you can typically say of any organization, in 6 months you're going to go bankrupt unless you do something about X, because those numbers are numbers that they typically rely on. So there are a set of numbers that they're familiar with. What's different is the interpretation, but most, certainly most senior managements can read a balance sheet, you can read a spreadsheet, they can read a set of management accounts, and so we can use that information that says this is the product of these things that you are doing. So consequently, and my prognosis is, if you carry on doing this, then these will be the consequences. You can look at, I did in one organization, I looked at recruitment and retention rates for employees, because it was quite clear when you looked at those things, and they were struggling to maintain their level of customer service. And the reason, one of the reasons they were struggling to do that, was because their churn rate of customer service staff was so high that actually their ability to deliver service was decaying faster than they could recruit people at the front end. Now, it wasn't a recruitment problem so much as a retention problem, and what it needed was an understanding of why they were struggling to retain staff, and that turned out to be a cultural problem rather than anything else, which, but you can use those assertions to draw their attention to the things that they need to fix, and that might be about the size. This is a really big problem. It might be about the criticality, which is a different scale. So it might be a small problem, but one which is critical in the whole, and which by solving it, you're able to make a number of other assertions. And the classic is obviously the Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, plugging that small leak. So there's two things going on there. One is the leak is being plugged, but more importantly, there's a whole resource that's not available. You need a finger, but you've got a whole body. There's a whole resource plugging a particular hole. The rest of the body isn't able to do anything useful while it's doing it. So you start to then get into a conversation about, here's your diagnosis, here's your prognosis, this is what's going on, and there's a whole resource here being used to do that, which is not, as a consequence, available to do these other things. And so unless you fix that little problem, you can never actually start to address these other big problems that result from it.
So we're in organizations here, and effectively what you've kind of done is, so we've got a diagnosis, and then we look at, well, what will happen if we do nothing? Because if we keep doing the same, we'll get the same. And you then took us into a number of examples at kind of more detailed levels, so elements of the system, where effectively you then are, if I understand it, in a bit of an iteration, because there's a bit more diagnosis that then goes on there about, what exactly is happening in that particular phase of the production piece, et cetera, and then you start to, see what needs to be changed if you're going to change the outcomes. So it might be the way you measure it, it might be the way you're operating or behaving. That's where you're going with that, isn't it? So
it isn't quite commonly, and it's important. Quite commonly, what's important to this is managerial response. So we've got the system operating, things are being done, burgers are being made, or things are being stuck in dikes, or whatever it happens to be. The information flow that comes from that says, we're not making as many, or they're not as good as they should be, or whatever. Now, a critical parameter is how does management respond to the information flow about the deficiencies? So we start to build up multiple cycles of things. So down here in our operating system, people are making widgets, they're delivering customer service, they're assembling burgers. That's going on the whole time, and there's a managerial governance element to that. There's a reflective cycle that sits on top of that, which is, is management doing the right thing. So our diagnoses start to aggregate vertically, if you like. So we've diagnosed the whole organization. We've then started to diagnose a part of it based on an assertion about some sort of prognostication about where it might end up. So we're zooming in onto smaller elements of the problem, and those smaller elements are set in the context of the wider one. So yes, even when we're doing prognosis, we're also redoing diagnosis. So the whole conversation, and that's why I describe it as a conversation, it is iterative, it is reflective, because all the time we're trying to understand whether the intervention we're making, whether it's a descriptive intervention, I think it looks like this, or a prognostic intervention, I think that will fail. All the time we're trying to test whether that assertion is correct and whether the consequence of the assertion is that something different is being done, which is having a beneficial effect. So we never quite stop having a conversation or a set of conversations which are reflective in themselves the whole time. So yeah, so we're doing diagnosis at a variety of levels, we're doing prognosis at a variety of levels, and we're trying to synthesize an outcome from that, which is reinforming the way we're thinking about the problem. So we've got multiple cycles of learning going on internal to the organization, as well as in the if you like, the intervention process, which also incorporates the organization. One of the things that often happens is that the diagnostic and prognostic process illuminates something in a particular way, such that people go off and change stuff anyway.
Yeah, so they take the action.
Actually, you don't need to make a decision, because people go, oh, I've never thought about it like that before, I'll do this instead, and the problem dissolves itself.
Yeah.
And Stafford talked about this a lot in his work, is I don't so much solve problems as dissolve problems. And I think there's an awful lot in that about the way in which we are able to illuminate a particular set of circumstances and the choices then people make as a result of that illumination. And so part of the job, if you like, in quite a profound way, is to point a light at the things that I observe to be dysfunctional, and in doing so help the people who own that problem to solve it for themselves.
So in a way, the bit that you the three phases here, diagnosis, prognosis, and the therapy, I mean, that therapeutic bit is going to sometimes happen just naturally as a result of the process of prognosis. Things get done. That's what you're saying there.
Yeah. And again, that comes back to that ownership of the ideas. If they're my ideas, I've got to sell them, I've got to promote them, I've got to come up with a project plan and do all sorts of interesting stuff around project management that frankly is tedious for everybody. Whereas if we can have a conversation which enables that change to happen because people in the organization choose to make it happen, then that becomes much easier. But the therapeutic stuff, if you're looking at the organization, you're going, well, you're all using chalk and blackboards, and you're writing messages on it, and actually you're not communicating fast enough to solve the problem. You need to think differently about how you communicate. Then you might end up thinking about information systems design, for example, and you go from the informality of a change arising from a difference in understanding to we need to buy and implement something that helps us do this. Or we had one with a paper mill. The screen at the front of the paper machine didn't filter the right things out, so there was a physical change in the machinery required. Which, it didn't matter how much you talked about it, that filter was always going to work in the way it worked. You needed a different filter. Now, the conversation let us illuminate the need for the filter, but out of which then arose a change project for the organization about we need to build a business case for doing this because it requires the investment in order to generate an outcome. And then you're into process change, information system change, and all the other stuff that flows from that. The trick, of course, is to make sure that the therapies, when applied, also obey the rules of cybernetic systems so that you're able to test and evaluate whether the change you've made actually has worked. And really the end game, in a sense, for an effective therapy is that the organization and all the people within it learn to treat themselves. So going back to your educational point, if at the end of the day, when you walk away, the people are kind of going, I wonder what he was doing here. Aren't we brilliant? We changed all that. Who was that chap? Then you've really won, because they have owned the diagnosis and the prognosis and the therapy, and they wonder why on earth they paid you.
So yeah, I'm intrigued by that, because when you were talking quite a bit earlier, I thought, well, having done this diagnosis at a kind of high level and prognosis, you then delve into a particular element of the system where you could be there for life, I'm thinking. So, and I guess you could, but at some point, the system is going to do those things for itself, and is going to go, well, why the hell have we got this person in our system? You know, so
and I think that's the the real success. And this is one of the challenges with the language of cybernetics and the history of cybernetics has been to exclude, not necessarily intentionally, but because it uses a somewhat arcane language and the thinking is different and the tools are unfamiliar. And consultants like to make a living. There's a whole bunch of reasons why there's an exclusive club of people who think and talk and act in the ways that people like me do. And whether it's intentional or not, the effect is to exclude. The effect is to create a boundary between the clever people and the less informed people, or whatever language is appropriate. And for me, the job is one of transduction. It's one of carrying information across boundaries and being able to engage in a conversation in the language of the subject, if you like, rather than the language of the cybernetician, that enables that ownership of ideas to take place. And even within an organization, and I've had this with engineering companies in the past, the people that make the product are engineers, and their language is the language of engineering, and it's very elegant and all sorts of things. But it's about engineering. And if you want them to make something bigger, faster, cleaner, or cheaper, the conversation you have with them is about how do you engineer the product. If you want to talk to the accountants about the way they keep the score for the organization, you have to go and have a conversation which is in the language of accounting, which is about costs and cost control and budgeting and all that sort of stuff. If you go and talk to the engineers, and many engineers are well informed financially, if you go and talk to them about cost control, then you lose richness in their model of the world, because their model of the world is an engineering model. If you say to them, how do we make it more efficient? How do we make the process of manufacturing more efficient? They'll happily engage in it, and they will deliver more efficient production systems, which as a consequence will be cheaper. So making it more efficient will lower its cost of operation. But you've got to have the conversation with them in the right language, and their language is the language of performance improvement in engineering terms, rather than cost control in accounting terms. So again, you have to go into this position where the reflection of the conversation has to be in the language of the people who own the ability to change it.
And this takes me right back to one of our earlier conversations, which was about how, what stops there being more cybernetics in the world. And, part of that was the education system and the fact that people do train as accountants or engineers, and they, therefore see the world through those particular lenses and frameworks. And what I'm hearing in in this conversation this morning is the kind of philosophy, actually not just consulting philosophy, but philosophy of cybernetics playing out in the work, because it's, it is about building models and understanding how systems work, but it's also about recognizing that actually it's dynamic. So a viable system will have people at the right level of recursion making choices about what they do. That's what I'm hearing you talking about in the philosophy of this.
Yes, and the understanding of what decisions I'm allowed to make. So that the notion, one of the critical things in generating an effective, viable system, an effective, intelligent organization, is the distribution of decision power. And for me, the philosophy is, what is it necessary for me to pull up towards the center, as opposed to what is it possible for me to distribute? So every decision should be taken as close to the decision, to the problem as possible, so that we delegate deliberately and consciously. We promote the autonomy of the individual within the system. So we're saying to them, your freedoms are bounded by these things. As a member of the system, you have to conform to certain minimal requirements, but within that, please use your intelligence and your thoughtfulness and your insight to do this job, and we constrain it as little as possible. Similarly, we need to be able to say to a chief executive, look, there are some really big decisions up here that you need to make. Stop interfering in the production of the widgets, because you don't know anything about it. It's not your area. You've got Fred or Charlie or Doris or Steve or Stephanie down there doing that for you. Leave them to get on with it. And creating that understanding of the necessary autonomy whilst maintaining the systemic cohesion. And that's the tension that you always get. So the really big job we all have to do as managers is to manage the tension across vertical and horizontal organizational boundaries, to make sure that we always maintain the space for people to work in, both formally in the sense of the decisions they're allowed to make, but also less formally and culturally, if you like, that their sense of ownership, of awareness, of freedom to decide, freedom to act, is sustained in the way that we choose to manage the organization. Because when we don't do that, our good people will pack their bags and leave. Very simply, great people, over-constrained, will say, well, I'll go and do this somewhere else where my skills and knowledge are appreciated. I won't bother doing it here because you guys don't get me. And off they'll go. So one of the things we need to do as we mature as people, as we mature as organizations, is recognize the learning of the people within the organization and actually give them more scope as they settle in. So we could start with somebody who's quite constrained because they've only worked here for a day. They don't know how anything works. They don't know what the rules are, etc. So our job is to teach them, to share with them that knowledge, and as we share with them, to give them greater and greater freedom. There are shades of this in situational leadership, Ken Blanchard's stuff. Now, although Blanchard talks about it purely in terms of the leadership functions, we can think about it in terms of our organizational autonomy and say, well, actually, if I give you, Stafford talked about it, if I set you down in a car in the middle of the desert, have I set you free? And the reality is, no, I've just changed the shape of the prison. So we have to think about how we do that, and how as managers, our job is not to administer yet another report, but to think about managing the freedoms of the people that work with us, and indeed managing our own freedom within that. So we end up, the classic story of how long have you worked here? 33 years, and so I've got 33 years experience, and well, actually you've got 1 year's experience 33 times, and there's a sort of huge difference between those things.
So I'm now going to take us back probably about half an hour of this conversation, where we took where there was a fork in the road, and we went, in my head at least, and we went into the kind of detail inside the system. And the fork in the road was when we were talking about the prognosis, and you were talking about what the future might look like. And of course, the other way of looking at what might happen is to look in the outside world. And you didn't really talk about that in the diagnostic phase, but presumably on some occasions, the cybernetic thinking and work takes us to an organization and a chief executive in that conversation you were describing who hasn't, spent any time or adequate time looking at what's happening in the outside world, and therefore has got an organization that is gradually, petrifying because it's not paying attention to major shifts. So that
yes,
felt like
and that was certainly unintended as a
well, no, but
act.
you know, and it felt like we took a fork. So,
Yeah.
and you may say, well, it's just the same. It's just done in a slightly different way. But I'd now like to think about when that chief executive starts talking about, well, you know, our future needs to look very different because here's what's changing in the external environment, and I've just arrived, and people have not thought about this for 20 years or whatever.
So Stafford called it the outside, and then we call it creating the future. So every organisation has to engage in creating its future. So yes, a part of the prognosis is, given this about us, then these things are likely to happen. And what I, of course, should have said is, and that's done in the context of an environment which is either supportive or not. So going back to my car example, the fact that I've got to stop making internal combustion engine cars in 2030 is a product of a piece of legislation which is cast in the sense of sustainability of the planet. So it's not something I can easily go back and challenge as a manufacturer, nor would I probably have much success were I to try to. So it's an environmental response. Peter Dudley, who you'll remember fondly, Peter wrote a paper called Food for Trees. And his essential thesis was that the organization survives by exchanging energy with its environment. I won't use the language he did, but essentially that's what's going on. We're ingesting energy from the environment and we're excreting waste products that we no longer need back to the environment, and actually excreting those waste products re-energizes the environment, and so we persist. So our viability is a function of that dynamic interaction between the organization, whatever we place the boundary, and the environment in which it sits. So that applies at chief executive level. It also applies at the level of the individual. So we are sitting here eating and breathing and drinking water and all that sort of stuff, but we're also, as individuals, thinking, today I'm a consultant, tomorrow I want to be a priest. So I want to have a different future. There are things in my environment that says I want to go and get a PhD or write another book or whatever. So what we're doing as an individual is we're saying, this is where I am at the moment. This is where I think I'd like to be in the future. This is the set of environmental conditions and constraints under which I might want to be it. What courses of action are available to me? So this does take us back to the sort of therapeutic choices bit in a sense. Because what I can do is conditioned by the environment in which I do it, but I am at the same time conditioning that environment. So all said for the sake of good form, whether it's an individual or an entire corporate body or a chief executive, that conversation has to happen. And one of the things the individual is doing is saying, can I be the person I want to be in the context of this particular organization, or shall I shove off and be me somewhere else?
If you think about it organizationally though, so with your cybernetic thinking, if the question is about future, would the offer remain similar? So effectively to the chief executive, you'd say, well, I can use these models to help you. I can help you create a model of the future by doing some diagnostic work about what might happen in that future in terms of, what might happen from a kind of environmental, but also a competitive and other, outside.
So what you might do there is think about what's the appropriate tool set for making assertions about likely futures. So yes, we can look at the cybernetics, if you like, of the environment, and let's say what's going on and how do those things fit together. What are the dynamic set of interactions and how might those influences play out in order to affect where we are and how we operate. Within that, there are things like systems dynamics. Systems dynamics is Jay Forrester's work, which allows you to create a dynamic description of the environment. You can model it in more or less formal ways. But what you're always seeking to do is bring in information about what's happening to the conversation in the trialogue that says, outside and then these things appear to be happening. How does that affect our posture as an organization? So your trialogue conversation brings together knowledge about the inside of the organization with knowledge about the world outside the organization, the choices we want to make based on our sense of identity, that then informs that tension. So we'll respond to this change in the environment by doing these things. That one we can ignore for a while, we can ignore it altogether because we don't think it'll ever affect us. But so there's a sophisticated conversation which is in biological terms is about balance. It's about maintaining an upright posture. So our internal mechanisms are responding to external information about the position of our head and the position of our body, and all the proprioceptors all over our bodies are continually taking autonomous action to maintain us in a more or less upright position. We can make a conscious choice about not responding to that if we want to, if we're fortunate to be able to. And the same thing is going on in the organization. So we're bringing in that external information, and we might be scanning for opportunities. So if we put our marketing heads on, we might be saying there's something happening over there. And we did this with a pharmaceutical company 10, 15 years ago. They were looking at the opportunity for a new therapeutic treatment in the cancer field. And the way that they were working meant they were never going to quite get to the end point they needed to get to in the time they had available to do it. So they sort of understood that because of the dynamics of the marketplace. So we were able to work with them to develop a different approach to development of a therapeutic, which allowed them to collapse some of the time. We saw the same thing last year in the context of the pandemic. The government sitting there, we're all going to die unless we do something about this. What's the process for developing a therapeutic, a vaccine, and how do we collapse the timeline on that process in order to get to a vaccine sooner? And that was what they did, was they changed the way that they exercised a regulatory process. So the real thoughtfulness there is about the synthesis of where am I now, where am I trying to get to, why do I think that's important, and how I bring those things together.
So, but what I'm hearing in that is that we might, if an organization or a system organization chief executive has gaps in the understanding of the environment, we might do a detour into the diagnostic part of that. But actually, if we are seeking to sustain the system and build the system, we will then find ourselves going back into the work you were describing earlier, which is about how all the different elements of it support the purpose. But, we might make a detour up to wider stuff if there's a lack of clarity about the purpose or the way in which that future is being created at the most senior.
So there's, again, you're back into the three conversations. If we're sitting in the middle of our trialogue and our conversation isn't going anywhere, we'd have to wonder why. We'd have to say, are we clear about what we're trying to achieve? So are we clear about sustaining the purpose and identity of the organization? Because if we're struggling to make a decision, to make a choice between two alternative futures, for example, why are we struggling with that choice? Well, is it because we're not clear about who we are? Is it because we're not clear about what we're currently doing? Is it because we're not clear about what's happening in the world outside us that we're seeking to respond to? So we have to have a much more thoughtful conversation than would typically be the case in, the habits of traditional thinking in organizations are, somebody comes along and says, we're not making enough we're not making enough money doing X, we ought to do Y instead. A paper is written by somebody that produces a marvelous business case, which is kind of looking at the future and saying, if we did this, this, and this, then we'd make X amount more money, or we'd have Y amount more impact. And then there's a debate that goes on, which is essentially about the allocation of resources to that business case or not. Very rarely is there anybody who puts their hand up and says, but please, miss, please, is that what we're really here for? But again, when it can't be decided, it's usually a lack of appropriate information. And which of those three dimensions of lack of appropriate information? Quite possibly all three. And of course, we have to play into that. There's an orthogonal slice through all this, which makes life a bit more complicated, which is that typically chief executives, senior executives are appointed to their role to either fulfill a particular promise or address a particular problem. So what we find is that the last chief executive was entirely focused on cost control, so everything was about cost, and there was nothing about sales. So when we appoint a new chief executive, we appoint somebody with a sales focus because costs are under control. So the entire attention of the organization shifts onto flogging stuff. Costs, meanwhile, ramp out of control. But actually, that was never the problem in the first place. So the real problem was nobody was buying the stuff because it wasn't very good. So the diagnosis then becomes inadequate. So you're saying, if you are asserting that this is the problem you're seeking to solve, where is the evidence that your assertion is properly?
Yeah, and
what's
I
the
hear that.
agenda of the people? So roles are occupied by people, and people have agendas of their own. So what's the agenda this person's been appointed to fulfill? And actually, is that appropriate to the needs of the organization? Or is it the response of a badly informed decision-making process that's decided this is the problem, but the diagnostic process that made that decision was itself inadequate? And that's rather more common than we would like to think.
And I guess as a cybernetician, you would have the insight to see that quite early on in those conversations. So you then make a choice about whether you're going to work in that system or not. I'm conscious.
Well, I think I think the cybernetics might offer you the chance to ask some different questions.
Yeah.
Rather more than anything. So what you're doing is the methodology is testing the evidence that underpins the assertion, rather than, and it's that testing that gives the different insight, rather than being a cybernetician that gives the insight. If you do
Yeah, okay. But so you take the detour into having that conversation, and then you can make a judgment about. I'm conscious of the time here, John, and I know we started off with an aspiration to talk about diagnosis, prognosis, and therapy, and I guess almost inevitably that has become a kind of blended between those different steps, and you've jumped around various through examples and case histories and things around it. But just any things we haven't covered, or final thoughts about those three stages: the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the therapeutic, and how you distinguish them?
To some extent you don't, because you're doing all three in parallel. I mean, the truth is, I think that when your diagnosis is informed by an understanding of the potential for difference. In understanding the potential for difference, you are mentally at least making some assertions about what might or might not go wrong, and in doing so you start to develop alternatives. So the conversation is doing all three things all of the time. Once you've got the conversation rolling, you are inevitably doing all three, and articulating them as separate is a useful device to help the conversation. Otherwise it becomes, as I suspect this has become once or twice, it's quite difficult to keep up. There's a lot going on. So actually segregating those things from each other and saying, here's my evidence, here's my diagnosis, and here's my evidence for that diagnosis. And we can have a sort of looping conversation that iterates and says, are you comfortable with my diagnosis? If you're not, what have I missed? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing that might want us to revisit that? What are the assertions I'm making about the future that arise from that diagnosis once tested? And does that hold water? Again, what's the evidence for that set of prognostications? And it might be, I've seen this 27 times before, and every time I've seen it, this happens. And it's, or it might be, well, it feels a bit like. So there are sort of levels of certainty that you might have with that conversation. And the therapy is really saying, well, this thing is so blindingly obviously wrong that you need to stop it because it's killing people. And so what are the consequences of stopping it? This other thing might be, well, here are some choices you might make. And a classic these days, if we talk about service organizations, is making a choice between human delivered customer service and automation. So many things, many services can be provided on the back of digital systems of various sorts. We can buy things through the internet, and the law allows us to send them back and all the rest of it. And the experience of customer service that we get from that is the envelope turned up when I expected it to. the goods inside might have been disappointing, but as opposed to my car's gone off for a service there, it's going to get plugged into a computer, and the computer's going to tell them what's wrong with it. But the fact is, they came to the house, they collect, they have a nice conversation with the chap who collects the car. He drives off, gets the car serviced and brings it back. The value proposition for me is about that authentic service and the engagement with the human being far more than it's about the diagnostic ability. So the companies have to make a choice about not what's the service that I'm going to deliver, but also how am I going to, or how are we going to deliver that service. And that's a reflection of their identity, of who they are as an organization, how they want to be perceived in their marketplace. So you're having a very sort of sophisticated conversation which says the therapy that might be appropriate to an organization that's focused on the sort of digitally enabled world, very different therapy to the one that's focused on the authentic customer service experience, which affects the cost structure, which affects the process, which affects the way they capture and use data. So there's a sort of values informed choices around the therapeutic process as well.
So I think that was yes, they are blended and blurred.
A lot.
And I think it's been very interesting to hear you talk about working with bringing cybernetics to life in client scenarios, and actually looking at effectively the consulting part of the system and the importance of knowing what your inputs to that are and what the outputs from that look like, and actually the stages we talked about enable you to make that visible to your client about the inputs, what you're doing and what they're getting as a result of it. So very interesting and helpful conversation. So thank you, John.